Hey guys, tonight we begin the curious case of Napoleon's pet rabbits. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the light, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So you may find yourself walking through a quiet, cobbled village road in 14th century France. It is just after sunset. Air is still, and the only sound is the rustling of distant leaves and the occasional chirp of insects preparing for night. Most villagers have already locked their doors. There's a strange hush about the evening, a tension not uncommon in towns gripped by medieval superstitions. As your feet crunch softly on the gravel, a distant hoot floats in on the breeze. You pause. An owl, somewhere close. And suddenly, you're not the only one pausing. Behind closed shutters, candles flicker out. A door bolts. You hear muttering. A death will come before dawn. For the medieval mind, owls were far more than just nocturnal birds. In a world where science had not yet replaced superstition, owls were deeply entangled with mystery, omen, and prophecy. Particularly in parts of Europe, the hoot of an owl was not simply background noise, it was a message, often a dire one. People believed it could foretell a death, announce the presence of evil, or even warn of bad weather that might ruin crops. The belief wasn't just held by peasants or illiterate villagers. Even in courtly circles where scholars pored over tomes of theology and natural philosophy, owls were given a peculiar place in the symbolic universe. Clergy wrote sermons warning of the owl's sinister nature. And paintings in churches often included these creatures tucked into the margins, waiting, suggesting judgment. Where do these beliefs begin? To understand that, you have to go back further well before the medieval period into the murky edges of classical antiquity. Owls were a complex symbol in ancient cultures. To the Greeks, the owl was the companion of Athena, goddess of wisdom. The Romans inherited this association, but they added a darker tint. For them, owls were also tied to the underworld and the omens it cast upward. Pliny the Elder, the Roman naturalist whose encyclopedic Naturalis Historia shaped much of medieval thinking, described the owl as a monster of the night. He recorded that if an owl appeared in the city, it was considered such a fearful omen that the place had to be ritually cleansed. When the Roman Empire fell and Christianity rose to dominance in Europe, the symbolism of the owl continued to evolve. The early church fathers, eager to absorb pagan symbols and reframe them, began to see the owl as a creature of spiritual darkness, one that fled from the light of truth and clung to the ignorance of sin. It wasn't long before this theological metaphor seeped into folk belief. The owl, once wise, became wicked. In medieval bestiaries, those illustrated collections of animal lore, the owl took on an increasingly ominous profile. Bestiaries were not concerned with biological accuracy. Instead, they were moral instruction manuals, and every creature had a lesson to offer. The owl was almost always depicted as filthy, blind during the day, and shunning the light. A moral lesson surely. Those who avoid the truth are like the owl, blind, dirty, and exiled to the night.
Ow.
This view was popularized by clerical writers and read aloud in monasteries, influencing how generations of people viewed the natural world. But while the church was moralizing the owl, peasants had their own, more visceral relationship with the bird. For them, the owl's sudden appearance in a barn or its cry near a window wasn't just a warning, it was an active prediction. Foretelling, the belief spread that if an owl cried near a home, someone within would die. If it circled a church steeple, it meant the gravedigger should prepare his tools. Children were told to spit over their left shoulder if they heard an owl, or else the bad luck would cling to them for days. Interestingly, there were regional variations. In some parts of Germany, the owl was thought to cry only when witches were nearby. In the British Isles, its call was linked to betrayal or impending war. Yet, even within these beliefs, a quiet sense of awe persisted. The owl was not entirely evil-lit. It was mysterious. It had access to information people didn't. It could see what others could not. Why was the owl chosen for this role? Not another bird. It may have had something to do with its appearance. With its flat face, large forward-facing eyes, and head that swiveled unnaturally far, the owl looks very unlike other birds. Its silence in flight, its nocturnal habits, and its sudden eerie cries all contributed to a sense of otherworldliness. Unlike songbirds that brought music to dawn, the owl seemed tied to death and the unseen. Moreover, owls were common, enough to be seen and heard regularly, especially in rural areas, but not so common that people were desensitized to their presence. They appeared just enough to be remembered, to leave an impression. In illuminated manuscripts, particularly those produced in English and French scriptoria, artists often included owls hidden in the margins. Sometimes they were alone, glaring, out at the reader. Sometimes they were mobbed by smaller birds, a visual metaphor for the righteous confronting sin. In other cases, owls were tethered or caged, indicating that darkness had been subdued, that ignorance had been captured. And yet, even as a symbol of ignorance, the owl remained alluring. Some monastic scholars took to studying owls, attempting to catalog their behavior. Did they really only hoot before someone died? Could they predict the weather? Were their feathers magical? The lack of concrete answers only deepened the mystery. In the courts of European kings, where astrologers and dream interpreters often shared space with military strategists, owls occasionally entered the lexicon of omens. A 12th century record from a French nobleman's diary notes that an owl flying across a wedding procession was taken as a terrible sign, and the marriage was postponed for 3 months. In another case, a noblewoman in Burgundy reportedly ordered her servants to kill an owl that perched near her child's cradle, convinced it had come to steal the baby's soul. These were not isolated incidents. They were part of a wider medieval worldview that saw the natural and supernatural as intimately connected. Every rustle of the wind, every unusual animal behavior could carry significance. It's difficult for us, in the modern world of electricity, science, and weather forecasts, to imagine living in such a symbolic universe. But for those in the medieval period, it was entirely natural. The owl, then, wasn't just a bird. It was a messenger, perhaps even a kind of prophet. But not all prophets speak clearly. There were moments when the owl's message was questioned. People began to wonder whether the hoot in the night really meant what they feared. After all, not every hoot was followed by a death. Not every owl that circled a tower brought misfortune. And some began to ask quietly, carefully, could the owl be misjudged? But such thoughts were dangerous, especially when shared aloud. So the owl remained both feared and revered. A feathered contradiction perched on the edge of night. Here, as the owl cries once again across the darkening village, we are left to wonder, did the medieval world fear owls because they represented death, or because they reminded people of what they could not control or understand? Imagine yourself now not in a village, but along the moss-covered walls of an aging monastery in 13th century England. The moon is high, casting pale light across the damp flagstones. Inside, monks chant in Latin, a slow, endless echo of psalms. Rising to the vaulted ceilings, outside, among the yew trees and weathered gravestones, an owl shifts on a broken branch. It stares into the dark, unmoving, watching. What was it truly that gave owls such a commanding presence in the medieval? Imagination. To understand that, we must go deeper, not just into myth, but into the daily life of those who lived with owls, both by choice and by chance. Though widely feared for their supposed prophetic powers, owls were also part of the fabric of medieval survival and utility. They were hunted, observed, studied, and even on occasion kept. Their feathers were used in folk medicine. Their habits were documented by curious naturalists, and some men made their livelihoods by hunting or trapping them not for sport, but for spiritual and agricultural protection. These men were known in some regions as night watchers or owl catchers. They served both practical and superstitious purposes. In agrarian communities where crops and livestock were lifelines, Owls could pose a threat to smaller animals, chicks, rabbits, or even house cats. But more often, they were considered threats not to animals, but to people's peace of mind. Owl catchers were often employed when a particular bird developed a reputation. Perhaps it nested too close to a village and cried too often. Perhaps someone died soon after its appearance. Perhaps a bad harvest followed one of its haunting midnight hoots. In any case, the solution was to trap the creature and either kill it or relocate it deep into the woods, usually after a blessing or a ritual. Records from a small town in southern Bohemia show that a local bishop issued permits in the late 1200s to allow certain men to pursue the birds of dread omen, which scholars later interpreted as owls. These men would build box traps, baited with small rodents or bits of meat and SCC. If the owl was caught, it was sometimes burned, sometimes buried. Sometimes its wings were clipped and it was kept in a cage, either as a warning to others or as a way to keep the misfortune contained. One curious case from the diocesan records of Rouen, France, details the journey of an owl that had been captured and tied to the roof of a church. The goal was not punishment, but atonement. The owl had cried on All Saints' Eve, and a villager died the following morning. The parish priest, uncertain of whether the death was a coincidence or a sign, ordered that the owl be tied with holy string and given food offerings.
Ow.
The bird lived for 6 days before it escaped. That year, no further deaths were recorded in the village, and so the event was marked as a successful appeasement of the unknown. It's strange to think of owls being judged by the court of human fear. But that was the medieval way. If something could not be explained, it had to be ritualized. This desire to give form and meaning to natural events extended beyond owls. Meteors, eclipses, stillborn animals, crooked trees, even mushrooms in a circle, each was folded into the grand narrative of what fate meant, how signs worked, and what humans could or couldn't do about it. In towns where literacy was rare, local priests and monks held the authority to interpret such signs. Some were skeptical, of course. There were those among the clergy who dismissed owl superstitions as pagan leftovers. A few even wrote treatises against the idea that birds could predict death. Yet, even among the educated, there was often a quiet respect for the long traditions of peasant belief. As long as it didn't challenge the church directly, many superstitions were allowed to live on. In this strange coexistence of fear and familiarity, the owl found its role. One monk, Brother Alaric of Lindisfarne, kept a journal in the early 1200s. In it, described how he would sometimes see an owl perched on the bell tower's ledge during his night vigils. He wrote not with fear, but with wonder. He noted the precision of its movements, the stillness of its body, and how it always seemed to arrive just after the 9th psalm was completed. He began to believe the owl was a kind of spiritual companion, not a demon, but a watcher of those who watched. This stands in stark contrast to how owls were viewed by ordinary villagers, many of whom left offerings near barns or crossroads to ward them off. These offerings were typically small grains, bits of bread, or herbs wrapped in cloth. In parts of Wales, people hung garlands of nettles and ash leaves near doors to prevent an owl's call from entering the home. Some also recited prayers, long winding chants that asked the Virgin Mary to cover the ears of the house. It's important to understand that these beliefs didn't come from a place of silliness or backwardness. They came from a deep-seated need to control uncertainty. In an age where sickness came without warning, where war could erupt at a moment's notice, and where a single bad harvest could spell starvation, any form of prediction, no matter how tenuous, was welcome. If the owl could warn you, even falsely, it was better than being caught unprepared. This belief was so entrenched that owls began to appear in personal charms and talismans. Some of these were meant to repel them. Others were designed to capture their power. Small amulets bearing owl feathers or images of their eyes were worn to protect against betrayal or unseen danger. In a few rare instances, women accused of witchcraft were found with such items sewn into the hems of their dress as evidence, according to prosecutors, that they consorted with the bird of shadows. We must tread carefully here. Not every medieval person feared owls. Some regions respected them as guardians of the forest. In parts of Eastern Europe, owls were believed to keep evil spirits away from fields at night. Shepherds left bits of meat atop fence posts to thank the silent hunters. In Lithuania and Belarus, they were seen as protectors of buried treasure, perhaps because of their habit of nesting in hollow trees near old ruins. There is also evidence from the 14th century of apothecaries using owl parts in medicine. Common remedy for seizures involved burning owl feathers and mixing the ashes with vinegar, then rubbing it on the temples of the afflicted. Another toniquon meant to induce dreams called for owl fat and the bark of the elder tree. These recipes were likely more symbolic than effective, but they underlined the duality of the owl in medieval consciousness: feared and useful, cursed and blessed. And then there were the performances. In some towns, particularly during spring, festivals or local saints' days, plays would be staged depicting the trial of the owl. These were half morality play, half exorcism. Person dressed as an owl, complete with feathered robes and a paper match. Mask would be brought before a costumed priest and a jury of villagers. The owl would be accused of bringing drought, death, or madness. After a trial filled with symbolic language and challenge response chants, the owl would either be forgiven and set free to laughter and dancing, or condemned and chased from town by children with wooden swords. These rituals served many purposes. Entertainment, of course, but also catharsis. They allowed people to act out their fears, to give name and form to the anxieties of their world. Unreadable and always watching was the perfect vessel for that. But what happens when a belief begins to erode? Toward the end of the 15th century, natural philosophers began to write more analytically about owls. With the spread of printed books and the slow rise of observational science, a new tone emerged. Writers like Albertus Magnus and Conrad von Megenberg began documenting the owl as a creature of nature rather than an omen. They described its diet, its nesting habits, and its seasonal patterns. Slowly, the owl was demystified, not entirely, but enough that its image began to change. Still among common folk, the old beliefs clung like lichen to stone. And here, in this quiet moment, where a monk hears a hoot and a child clutches her blanket tighter, we are left to consider a lingering question. Was the owl truly feared, or was it simply misunderstood? A scapegoat for a world too large to explain. Let's sit now inside a modest wooden farmhouse in the Low Countries. Somewhere around the year 1490, the fire has burned low, and shadows play along the timber beams. An old man sits near the hearth, hunched forward, weaving a small straw basket. His granddaughter listens closely as he recounts a story one he heard as a boy about an owl that perched atop the steeple. The night before a fire swept through their village. He doesn't say the owl caused it, simply says the owl knew, and that somehow was worse. As the 15th century waned, Europe stood at a strange crossroads. The medieval worldview, full of omens, saints, and symbolic animals, was beginning to shift under the growing weight of observation, exploration, and early science. The owl, long imprisoned in the tower of superstition, found itself slowly, hesitantly released into a new understanding. But old beliefs, especially those tied to fear, die slowly. Even as natural philosophers began to reclassify the owl not as a harbinger of doom, but as a predator with a biological role, the people of the countryside remained unconvinced. In quiet villages and forested hamlets, the owl still cried at night, and death still came without warning. The cause and effect was too tempting to abandon. The hoot preceded a death, the pattern was confirmed. If it didn't, it was forgotten. Pattern-seeking minds held tightly to ancient threads. Some early printed herbals and natural histories began to challenge the old view. The Hortus Anatitis, published in 1491, listed the owl not among the birds of evil omen, but in a new category. Birds of solitary habit. It described their nocturnal nature and unique feathers, noting that they helped control rodent populations. A quiet rebranding had begun, one that would continue, slowly, through the Renaissance. And yet, deep in the margins of books and the corners of chapels, the old owl lingered. The Renaissance brought with it a new kind of curiosity. Artists like Albrecht Dürer included owls in engravings, not always as symbols of darkness, but sometimes as elements of landscape or allegory. Still, even in these more balanced portrayals, the owl carried its baggage. It became a symbol not of evil, but of mystery. It's not a prophet of doom, but a question. What do we not yet understand? It was during this time that the owl began to reappear. In literature, not as a menace, but as an intellectual companion. In a strange twist, the very creature once feared for foretelling death became a symbol of hidden knowledge. Writers and scholars, surrounded by the shifting sands of humanism and early modern science, began to look at the owl not as a threat, but as a metaphor for what lay just beyond the reach of human comprehension. The transformation was not complete. Of course, far from it. In Elizabethan England, for instance, Shakespeare still used owls in ominous ways. In Macbeth, the owl's cry is described as the fatal bellman, signaling Duncan's murder. And yet, even this reflects a lingering medievalism and echo rather than a dominant worldview. Meanwhile, in the quieter corners of Europe, peasants still nailed owl carcasses to barn doors to ward off evil or to stop more owls from coming. Some placed owl feathers under mattresses to prevent nightmares. Others hung carved owls from trees, near graves to keep the souls from wandering. By the early 1600s, however, the shift was clear. The great encyclopedists of the era such as Eulis, Aldrovandi and John Reich classified owls with increasing biological precision. Drawings focused on beak shape, wingspan, and skeletal form, rather than eyes glowing with imagined foresight. The owl had become an animal again, but something strange lingered. Even in our modern world, long after electricity pushed back the night and meteorology replaced folk weather lore, the owl remains uncanny. You hear it in rural silence, or see its eyes in a flashlight beam, and something primal stirs. Not necessarily fear, but reverence. An echo of something older. This may be because the owl never fully left our symbolic world. It simply changed addresses. From witchcraft to wisdom. From harbinger to helper. From feared prophet to academic mascot. Today, we associate owls with intelligence, libraries, and depth of perception. They adorn graduation cards in university crests. Athena's owl has returned in full glory. But beneath that wise exterior lies a history rich with contradiction. In truth, the medieval belief that owls could predict your future was not entirely about the bird itself. It was about a need to read the world, to find signs in the noise, to prepare for sorrow, even if falsely. The owl offered a method, however flawed, to map the chaos. Perhaps that's what gives the owl its timeless power. Because even now, we seek meaning in signs. We look for patterns, omens, and assurances. We scan the skies for comets, analyze dreams, and listen to gut feelings. We ask the universe to give us a signal. And when it doesn't, we invent one. The owl, watching from its perch, has seen this before. It saw the candlelit rituals of frightened villagers, the whispered prayers, the pages of bestiaries, the twisted masks in pageants, the torn pages of early scientific texts, and it watches us now in our modern glow, still unsure. So perhaps the owl did predict the future, not because it foresaw events, but because it represented the part of us that never stops trying to know what lies ahead, the part that fears, part that hopes, part that listens to the night. And as you close your eyes, imagining the owl's silhouette on an old stone tower, you might wonder if a bird could truly tell your future. Would you listen, or would you rather not know? You're standing just outside the crumbling city gates of Padua in the early 1300s. The wind smells faintly of parchment, horse sweat, and the distant sea. A worn leather satchel creaks at the side of a man who waits alone by a postmarker carved with the sigil of the Venetian lion. His breath is even steady. He does not look hurried. But he is one of the most crucial links in a machine that stretches from the Alps to the eastern Adriatic. He is a postmaster, or, more precisely, a courier for the Venetian Corriere di Stato, the state's secretive but impressively efficient communication system. While merchants and nobles garner the attention of most historical chronicles, the world of the medieval courier delivering sealed parchment across dangerous routes is a tale barely whispered but profoundly important. In the early 14th century, Venice was more than just a city. It was a living map of influence, stretching across ports and territories. Stitched together by a network of trade routes, alliances, and administrative duties. To manage such a decentralized sprawl, Venice needed something far more mundane than galleys or gold. It needed information, fast, accurate, and continuous. This gave rise to the Corriere di Stato, a small but vital corps of professional messengers, who operated much like arteries in a vast and unseen body. Their job was not glamorous. They didn't fight wars or negotiate treaties. They carried news slowly on horseback, often through hostile or unmarked terrain between city-states, ports, bishops, and courts. Though rarely mentioned in epic, poems, or illuminated manuscripts, these postmasters and couriers were the ones who ensured Venice could act with foresight. Their work shaped diplomacy, commerce, and even war. And yet their names were seldom recorded. The quiet anonymity of these men and their system would become one of the Venetian Republic's greatest tools of power. Before the rise of centralized postal systems, communication in medieval Europe was ad hoc at best. Messages were carried by pilgrims, merchants, friars, or servants, none of whom specialized in the art of delivery. But Venice, obsessed with efficiency and secrecy, created its own infrastructure. The system was surprisingly advanced. Key cities across the Venetian mainland and maritime empire had designated postal stations, typically located in monasteries, taverns, or town halls. These stops offered food, shelter, and a place to rest fresh horses. Couriers traveled in shifts, much like relay racers, ensuring that messages could travel farther and faster than would be possible with a single rider. The Venetians even developed coded markings on official state letters to designate priority, secrecy, and route. These weren't modern ciphers, but they were effective a system of wax seals, corner notches, and ink stamps that postmasters understood at a glance. Some messages were so sensitive they were transported only under the cover of darkness and in double-sealed envelopes, often stitched closed with silk thread. At the center of it all was the Savi Ali letter Segretha Council of Secret Letters. This group of magistrates oversaw all state communication. They dictated who could send letters, who could receive them, and who was trusted to carry them. A breach in this network could have dire consequences. Couriers who lost the letter or opened one unlawfully could be imprisoned or worse, exiled from the Republic entirely. So why don't we hear about them more often? Because the couriers were meant to disappear. Their success was measured in silence. If a message arrived, it was the sender who received credit. If it failed, the courier took the blame. Their function was infrastructural essential but invisible. And yet, the story of the Venetian postal network offers a rare glimpse into how ordinary labor shaped extraordinary outcomes. Take, for instance, the Battle of Chioggia in 1380, a pivotal conflict between Venice and Genoa that nearly ended the Republic's dominance. What turned the tide wasn't just naval strategy or mercantile wealth. It was the timely arrival of a letter. As the Genoese fleet cornered Venetian ships in the lagoon, a courier arrived with news that Hungarian reinforcements, unexpected and hastily hired, were approaching from the north. This intelligence allowed the Venetians to stall long enough to regroup and turn the tide. The courier who brought the letter is unnamed, forgotten, but without him, Venice might have collapsed. Likewise, in the mid-1300s, during the outbreaks of plague and famine, Venice relied heavily on its couriers for logistical information. While other cities were paralyzed by rumor and fear, Venice used the state courier network to track the spread of illness, reroute ships, and enforce quarantines. Letters between health magistrates and port authorities became lifelines. Couriers, of course, faced dangers beyond disease. Highwaymen and bandits were a constant threat, especially in the mountain passes and forested stretches between posts. Some messengers traveled armed, others disguised themselves as monks or pilgrims to avoid suspicion. Their best defense was speed and silence. Still, not all messages made it through. A document from 1377 in the Venetian archives details the execution of two couriers who were found to have sold copies of state letters to rival merchants in Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik. Their names, again, are missing. Their crime, breaking the seal, the punishment, permanent erasure from the record. And then strangely, there was the year the system simply stopped. In 1423, a sudden, unexplained pause occurred in the courier registry. For 6 months, there are no entries. Deliveries logged, no names listed, no messages recorded. Historians have puzzled over this absence. War did not break out. No plague was noted. It is as though, for half a year, the invisible bloodstream of Venice halted. When the records resume, nothing is said about the gap. Business continues as if uninterrupted. Silence remains one of those small, yawning holes in the medieval recorda, reminder of how easily crucial systems can vanish from sight. And yet, that silence may be the most telling part of all, because it's in these gaps, the forgotten months, the uncredited couriers, the unnamed postmasters, that we see how history often flows through the unseen. While kings and merchants argued in public, it was the quiet men on horseback, carrying brittle paper through mountain storms, who made decisions possible, who warned of wars, confirmed alliances, and rerouted ships just in time. The Venetian courier system wasn't the first of its kind, nor was it the largest, but it was among the most effective. It set a precedent that would ripple into the postal networks of the Habsburgs, the Ottomans, and eventually the Royal Mail and Pony Express. But for now, picture again that solitary man outside Padua. His boots are cracked. His horse is thin. His satchel is sealed. He does not carry a sword, but he carries something far heavier, a sentence that might shift a battle or end a truce or save a fleet from plague. He will hand it off, wordlessly, to the next rider, and so on, across marsh and plain, cross centuries. And as he disappears down the road, the question lingers. If the fate of empires once rested on a piece of paper no larger than your hand, carried by a man whose name you'll never know, what else has history forgotten? The year is 1452, in the candlelit back room of a Venetian customs house. A middle-aged clerk, dressed in plain wool robes, hands smudged with inklings over a parcel no larger than a folded napkin. It is sealed in deep red wax, bearing the unmistakable imprint of the Serenissime, the most serene Republic of Venice. But the seal isn't just decoration, it is law. Breaking it unlawfully could carry a sentence of imprisonment, exile, or worse. He sets the parcel aside and begins to log its arrival in a thick, vellum-bound ledger, one of thousands that will never be read. This was the way of the Venetian courier system, not flashy, not secretive in a cloak and dagger sense, but orderly, disciplined, and deeply respected, especially by those who depended on its silence. In this section of our story, we move deeper, not just into the logistics of the courier system, but into its strange dual nature, both functional and ceremonial. Though its surface purpose was simple communication, the network also became a tool of ritual and power. It's the act of writing, sealing, transporting, and receiving a letter carried its own set of customs, half bureaucracy, half liturgy. For instance, the seal. More than a method of closing a letter, the seal was a signature, a warning, and a form of encryption all in one. The color of wax, the design of the impression, and even the placement of the seal told the recipient how the message should be handled. Black wax suggested urgency. Green meant it was from a health magistrate, possibly plague-related. Double seals indicated that the outer seal could be broken by a secretary or lower official, but the inner one only by the recipient. Some letters came sewn shut with silk thread. Others had thin strips of parchment called tailpieces that wrapped around the missive like a leash, bearing notations in shorthand known only to couriers and state readers. These were not the inventions of poets or codebreakers. They were the careful innovations of officemen, scribes, and writers who understood that the integrity of information was a matter of life and death. But what did these letters actually say? You might imagine that most were full of intrigue or royal secrets. Some were, but the majority were far more mundane. Reports on grain prices, port tax records, notices of rainfall totals and ship arrivals, instructions for municipal repairs, updates on salt storage or water levels, tedious things. The kinds of things empires are built on, and the kinds of things that lull listeners like you to sleep. Occasionally, though, the courier system carried what were known as letter reserved letters. These were typically addressed to the Doge himself or to senior members of the Consiglio dei Dieci Council of Ten, Venice's shadowy governing body known for managing internal security, espionage, and high-level diplomacy. These letters might concern the movement of troops in a rival city, the suspicious activities of an ambassador's family, or rumors overheard in a Florentine tavern. Couriers who carried letter reservate often did so without knowing it. Letters were placed in pouches sealed within larger pouches, handed off only between trusted relay riders, and always delivered by hand. And even then, many such letters were never read aloud in council. They were filed, coded, or sometimes burned, especially if their contents involved state vulnerabilities or court scandals. The information was received, digested, and then made to disappear. This reliance on the courier system created an unexpected side effect: record keeping. Venetian officials, obsessed with documentation, logged nearly every movement of every official message. Arrival times, names of riders, the state of the weather, the health of the horse, everything was entered into sprawling ledgers kept in stone vaults. Today, these dusty books sit in archives in Venice, Padua, and Treviso. Historians who stumble upon them are often overwhelmed, not by the drama of the contents, but by their dull, relentless precision. And yet, that precision tells its own story. It tells of a society that tried desperately to track the flow of its own voice. A republic that ruled not just with ships and trade, but with paper and passage. A government that recognized the power of timely knowledge and built one of the first recognizable bureaucratic postal systems to preserve it. Still, the system was not immune to error or to misuse. There are reports from 1461 of a courier who, en route to Ferrara, stopped at a roadside inn and drank too deeply of a local spiced wine. He fell asleep, and the parcel he carried was taken by a fellow traveler. The letter was later found open in the marketplace and read aloud for entertainment, contained only a discussion about olive tariffs. But the breach was taken seriously. The courier was dismissed, fined, and permanently barred from service. Another case, a young courier, carrying medical reports from Dalmatia, was waylaid by local authorities who suspected him of espionage. Though innocent, he was held for weeks, his horses confiscated, and his messages destroyed. Venice lodged a formal complaint, and within a year, trade with that region quietly ceased. No declaration of war, no overt reprisal, just silence. This kind of quiet retribution was typical of Venice. The Republic preferred to let its couriers do the speaking and its silence do the punishing. Even the architecture of Venice reflected this obsession with controlled communication. The Palazzo Ducale, or Duce's Palace, had entire chambers dedicated to the reception and analysis of letters. Pigeonholes for sorting, special wax melting stations, map tables for plotting delivery routes, and vaults heavy, locked vaults for storing both letters and ledgers. Visitors seldom saw these rooms, but they were as crucial to Venetian power as the grand halls or marble staircases. If the Rialto Bridge connected parts of the city, these rooms connected the Republic's past, present, and future. And so, letter by letter, the postmasters and couriers continued their work. Rain or sun, peace or plague, letters moved. The system even adapted during outbreaks of the Black Death. Special couriers were designated for plague communication, required to change clothes at every station, and prohibited from touching local residents. Letters were fumigated over sulfur or vinegar steam before being opened. Still, the system kept running, slowly but surely. In an era where rumor killed more swiftly than disease, the steady arrival of a known courier brought something rare: certainty. There's something profoundly moving about that a rider galloping across the plains of Lombardy. knowing that somewhere in a distant port city, a magistrate is waiting for a scrap of paper with a scribbled note about cargo quotas. The courier does not know why the paper matters. He does not need to. His job is to arrive and then to vanish. And so we return to the paradox at the heart of the Venetian courier system. Its power came not from speed, though it was fast for its time, nor from its secrecy, though it was secure. Its power came from its invisibility. The less people noticed it, the more effectively it worked. In a city obsessed with theater, spectacle, and ritual, the postmasters worked in plain rooms, wore plain clothes, and spoke little. But empires don't survive on pageantry alone. They survive on updates, on margins, on ledgers, on the ability to say, "We knew before they did." And so, once again, as a new rider exits a city gate, his satchel light, his eyes ahead, we must ask, in a world shaped by those who speak loudest, what is owed to those who only carried the words? As the Venetian sun dipped behind the domes of San Marco and shadows pooled in the alleyways of the Sistine, a familiar scene played out in the narrow lanes of Cannaregio. A courier, barely noticed, passed between buildings carrying nothing but a leather satchel and the quiet authority of the Republic.
Oh.
No fanfare, no audience, only the sound of soft footsteps against wet stone. This was how messages traveled in Venice, deliberately, almost invisibly. A whisper in a city of orators. The final section of our story considers what became of the courier system when time wore down the Republic's power and how, like many things in Venice, its most loyal messengers began to disappear, not in revolution, but in erosion. Golden age of maritime and commercial supremacy did not last forever. The rise of the Ottoman Empire in the east, the emergence of Portuguese trade routes around Africa, and the shifting political alliances of Europe slowly chipped away at the city's influence. But even as foreign ships began to outnumber Venetian galleys in distant ports, the couriers continued their steady work. In fact, the courier system arguably became more important in decline. When threats multiplied, knowing where your enemies stood on when they moved mattered more than ever. And so, while the Doge's robes grew more ceremonial and Venice's military might waned, the postmasters redoubled their efforts. They updated delivery routes, trained younger riders, introduced a formal complaint system, and even added rudimentary cipher practices for sensitive reports. The couriers themselves aged along with the Republic. In the late 1500s, you could still find elderly messengers who had ridden through plague quarantines, outrun storms along the Adriatic, or carried secret treaties folded inside hollowed-out walking sticks. They rarely spoke of these things. Most didn't think their work worthy of stories. But occasionally, in the smoky back corners of taverns or during long ferry rides to the islands, a story would emerge. One such tale concerns a courier named Bastiano, who in 1593 was tasked with delivering a single letter to the bailo of Constantinople. The journey was dangerous, not just because of the distance, but because Venice and the Ottomans were teetering between uneasy peace and quiet hostility. Bastiano traveled under assumed identities, disguised his documents as religious tracts, or reportedly spent 3 weeks hiding in the quarters of a Greek candlemaker to avoid detection by Ottoman patrols. The letter, when finally delivered, simply read, "Do not speak. Watch the southern shore." We will never know what it meant, but it arrived when it was meant to. That, in the end, was all that mattered. As the centuries turned, the courier system evolved. Horses gave way to carriages. Sea routes became more regular. Post stations in places like Verona, Padua, and Udine were expanded and staffed with professional postmasters, many of whom had spent decades on the road themselves. By the 1700s, Venice maintained a sprawling communication grid that rivaled those of much larger empires. But the city itself was hollowing out. Power shifted from the Deutsch and his councils to the merchant families and foreign consulates. The courier system, once the arteries of the Republic, was now a legacy system, still functional, still trusted, but increasingly outpaced by the postal innovations of other European powers like France, Prussia, and Britain. Then came 1797, Napoleon marched into the city without resistance. The Venetian Republic, after over 1,000 years of independence, fell not with a war, but with a surrender. The Doge abdicated. The Great Council was dissolved. And with it, the quiet machinery of state, the couriers, the wax seals, the shadow. Ledgers shuddered to a halt. For a few months, nothing moved. Then, under French administration, the courier system was repurposed, restructured, and renamed. Many postmasters lost their positions. Others quietly took up work under the new regime. A few fiercely loyal to the old order vanished into the countryside, taking with them their satchels, their stamps, and their silence. And so, for a time, the long silence of the Venetian postmasters became literal. The whispers they had carried for centuries fell mute. But history, like the sea, leaves traces. In 1824, a Venetian archivist cataloging old state papers in a crumbling office near Campo San Giacomo dell'Orio uncovered a trove of unopened letters from the early 1600s. Many were never delivered. Some bore triple seals. Others had notes, scribbled across them in the slanted hand of writers long dead, delayed by flooding, held for clearance, recipient deceased. One letter, dated 1612, was addressed to the keeper of the arsenal and marked urgent. It was still sealed. The archivist, unsure of protocol, placed it gently in a drawer where it likely remains to this day unread. There's something deeply human about that drawer. It reminds us that the life of a letter doesn't end when it is written, or even when it is read. It ends when its meaning has passed beyond usefulness, when no one is left who remembers the sender or the reason it was sent. And the couriers, they too, fade like old ink. We have portraits of doges, maps of naval battles, and journals from merchants and painters. But the couriers rarely wrote memoirs. They left no monuments, no memoirs or eulogies, only worn boots, scuffed satchels, and the occasional logbook entry noting, "Arrived." No delay. And yet without them, those other stories might never have happened, or never been known. They were not generals, not senators, not poets. They were the blood vessels of a government that trusted the written word more than the sword. They ferried instructions, apologies, strategies, and warnings across mountains, borders, and decades. They carried the daily heartbeat of a fragile republic. And now, dear listener, as the gondolas moor in the dark canals and the last bells of Venice echoed through the fog, let us give quiet thanks to those who carried paper, not for glory, but for duty, who delivered words not for applause, but because it was their appointed task, who, in a world of shouting, chose to move in silence. And with that, we gently close the ledger. Let the ink dry, let the wax cool, let the words rest. Long before restaurants were hushed by candlelight or cafes offered quiet hours for writing and reading, there existed places where silence during meals wasn't just preferred, it was sacred. In a medieval world filled with clanging forges, barking merchants, and tolling church bells, one would not expect tranquility to be found in the clatter of a refectory. And yet, within the thick stone walls of certain monastic communities, particularly those following the rule of Saint Benedict, silence wasn't simply the absence of noise, it was a kind of devotion. Our story begins not with a dramatic battle or a royal decree, but with the simple ringing of a small brass bell somewhere in the hills of 12th century Burgundy. That bell signaled mealtime. It echoed through the scriptorium, across the vegetable gardens, and down into the root cellars, calling the brothers of the Abbey of Quito to table. But as they filed in robes brushing stone, sandals whispering, across the floor no one spoke. Not a greeting, not a blessing, not a single word. The silence, like the fragrance of baking rye bread and boiled turnips, settled over the room in thick, calm layers. To understand why monks ate in silence, we must understand what they believed about sound in the soul. The Rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, shaped the daily lives of thousands of monks for centuries. It was a guide to a balanced life of prayer, work, and study. It emphasized humility, obedience, and, above all, discipline of the tongue. Speech, according to the rule, was to be measured carefully. Too many words, it warned, could lead to idle gossip, boastfulness, or worse, sinful pride. Better than to let silence be the companion of the humble. And where better to test the virtue of restraint than the dinner table, where hunger and comfort tempt the body and loosen the tongue. In the great refectories of Europe's abbess from Cluny in France to Monte Cassino in Italy, mealtime became a solemn ritual. But these were not joyless meals. The monks sat on long wooden benches at narrow tables, usually facing one another but refraining from eye contact. Food was plain, often vegetarian: lentils, beans, onions, cheese, and black bread. On feast days, perhaps a bit of salted fish or spiced wine. Meals were taken in near silence, save for the quiet clinks of spoons on bowls or the scratch of a bench leg against the floor. But there was one voice. A designated monk known as the reader stood at a lectern and recited scripture, hagiographies, or moral instruction throughout the meal. His voice floated above the heads of the diners, steady and calm. The idea was simple. While the body was nourished, so too should be the mind. This was no casual reading. The reader had to practice beforehand to ensure clarity, rhythm, and reverence. He could not stumble or mispronounce. Doing so might distract the brethren, or worse, require someone to speak to correct him.
Alice.
The silence of the refectory was a deeply orchestrated quiet. But monks still needed a way to communicate. Enter the language of signs, a visual vocabulary developed by necessity and refined over centuries. Over time, these silent signals grew remarkably complex, particularly among Cistercians and Carthusians. Want to ask for bread? Touch the lips. Then hold up a clenched fist. Need water? Draw a wavy line in the air with 2 fingers. Cheese. Mimic the shape of a wheel with your hands. You could request a spoon, a napkin, or even indicate that someone had dropped a pea under the table all. Without saying a word, there were signs for concepts as specific as today is a fast day. I've already eaten, and Brother Thomas is asleep in the garden again. Some abbeys recorded as many as 300 different hand signals passed down from senior monks. To novices, like a sacred code, signs weren't used. Frivolously using the wrong one could result in a day of penance or kitchen duty. But when used well, they transformed a silent meal into a symphony of subtle gestures. Outside observers found it bizarre. When visiting clerics or dignitaries attended a monastic meal, they often reported the eerie quiet of the dining hall as otherworldly. One 13th century bishop reportedly compared the experience to supper among angels if angels ate lentils and cabbage. But to the monks, the silence was not alien. It was comfort. It allowed them to be present, to chew with mindfulness, to consider the text being read, and to sit in humble equality with their brothers. And yet not every monk welcomed the silence. Throughout the Middle Ages, internal records and letters reveal that some monks struggled with the discipline. Young novices were often the most prone to whispering or laughter. One abbot, writing to a fellow in 1272, complained that Brother Aldrich smuggled in a fig and made 3 jokes about the cook's feet during dinner. Punishments varied. A minor slip might result in extra chores or loss of evening privileges. Repeated talking could mean fasting or temporary isolation. But harshness was rare. The goal wasn't punishment. It was cultivation. The quiet dining room was a training ground for a quiet heart. Still, not all monasteries agreed on the strictness. Some Benedictine houses allowed occasional speech at meals, especially during feast days or when entertaining guests. Others maintained the silence more strictly, but allowed designated whispering corners for necessary communication. By the 14th century, some orders began relaxing the rules. The Dominican friars, more involved in preaching and public life, kept their meals relatively quiet, but not entirely mute. Jesuits, who emerged later, prioritized intellectual discussion and allowed meals to be accompanied by academic debate. But the contemplative orders, the Carthusians, the Trappists, and certain Cistercian communities clung to the tradition of silent dining well into the modern age. Even today, in a handful of monasteries across Europe and North America, you can witness the ancient practice. If you were to visit Mount St. Bernard Abbey in Leicestershire or walk the cloisters of La Grande Chartreuse in the French Alps, you'd find monks dining as they have for centuries, silently, with slow gestures, listening as one of their own reads aloud the words of saints or scripture. In a world addicted to constant noise, the quiet of these meals carries a strange kind of rebellion or refusal to let conversation become compulsion. It is hard, after all, to gossip in silence, or to argue, or to boast, or to complain about the soup. The silence turns the meal into a meditation. Not on food, not on hunger, but on humility. Because in the quiet, one begins to notice things. The sound of one's own chewing, the pace of another's breathing, the heat of the bread just pulled from the oven, the texture of the wood grain beneath your fingers, the weight of a sentence spoken 30 feet away by a single calm voice. And so the monk, like the meal, is slowly transformed. If you had entered a medieval monastery at mealtime, one of the first things you might have noticed, aside from the profound silence, was the precision. Not in the way modern people mean efficiency, but in a softer, more deliberate sense. The entire structure of the day, including meals, was governed not by appetite or impulse, but by the intricate flow of monastic time. And once you begin to understand monastic time, the silence of the dining hall begins to make even more sense. Medieval monks did not tell time with watches or clocks at least not at first. Their days were ruled by a different rhythm, the divine office, a cycle of 8 prayer services spaced across the 24-hour day. The divine office was not a modern 9-to-5 schedule. It began before dawn, often around 2 or 3 a.m., with matins or vigils, followed by lauds at sunrise. Then came prime the 1st hour, terce the 3rd hour, sext the 6th, and none the 9th. With vespers at sunset and compline just before bed, meals were usually slotted between sext and nunso. Around midday, but here's the thing, midday wasn't fixed. It shifted with the seasons. Time itself flexed and bent around light and prayer. In winter, the days were shorter, so the midday meal came earlier. In summer, it arrived later. There were no clocks on the wall, only the sun's angle, the singing of the psalms, and the feel of the light through stained-glass windows. In a way, monks felt time rather than measured it. Time was not a mechanical ticket, was a living rhythm. That rhythm shaped how they ate. No one rushed into the refectory with a rumbling stomach and a fast-food mindset. The process began long before the food appeared. First, the bell rang not just once, but in a deliberate pattern. In some abbeys, it was rung in 3 stages. Once to announce preparation, again to call the monks from their tasks, and a final peal to signal the procession into the hall. Each monk stopped what he was doing, washed his hands in a stone basin, and waited patiently, often in the cloister garden, until all were assembled. They entered to by 2, heads bowed, hands folded or tucked inside their sleeves. Each monk had a designated seat. Seating was not about seniority or power, but about order. The abbot or prior sat at the head of the table, not to preside, but to model humility. Then came the blessing, spoken only by the appointed celebrant. A single voice, a single phrase. Then silence. The food, as ever, was simple. But its simplicity was not accidental, it was a form of restraint. The rule of St. Benedict warned against the sin of gluttony and advised moderation. A monk might receive half a loaf of bread, a bowl of stew, and perhaps a slice of cheese or fruit. If the orchard was in season, they ate slowly. His slowness wasn't just about digestion, it was about alignment. Their pace followed the rhythm of the reader's voice, which was deliberately calm. Monks weren't permitted to interrupt, ask questions, or laugh even if the text being read was humorous. Hagiographies had their amusing moments, and medieval saints were not always serious. But laughter, like talk, was for another time. Here in the refectory, one focused on chewing, on listening, and on stillness. Occasionally, a monk would glance up to signal a need, perhaps an extra slice of bread or a refill of water, but only through gestures. The kitchener, or server, appointed for that week, moved quietly between tables, responding with equal subtlety. The entire meal might last only 30 minutes, but in that time, a strange transformation occurred. In our modern world, meals are often hurried or distracted while scrolling, working, or talking. But for the monks, mealtime was its own form of prayer. The silence didn't make the meal shorter, it made it longer, in the best way. Time seemed to stretch. A spoonful of lentils carried weight. A sip of water had presence. Some described it as the meal that never ended, because its impact lingered. The silence continued as the monks filed out, returned their bowls and spoons, and walked slowly back to their work or study. Only after they'd left the refectory could quiet. Functional speech resume, and even then, it was minimal. They carried the quiet with them like a second robe. Not all monasteries experienced time the same way. As mechanical clocks became more common in the 14th and 15th centuries, some abbeys installed water clocks or gear-driven devices to track hours more precisely. Yet even these innovations bowed to the spiritual rhythm. One famous example is the astronomical clock at St. Albans Abbey in England, which not only measured time but also marked the phases of the moon, the times for prayer, and key liturgical dates. It chimed not for commerce, but for contemplation. Still, most monks resisted the clock's tyranny. Time, they believed, was sacred, not something to be chopped into minutes or monetized. That belief extended to food. Many monastic writers left notes on the virtue of savoring, not in a culinary sense, but as a form of awareness. Eating bread, they argued, was also remembering the labor of the baker, the grower of wheat, the gift of rain, and the miracle of yeast. Even a cabbage had meaning. One Cistercian manual from the 13th century advised, "Let the brother who eats a turnip remember that it was once in darkness and now nourishes him as light nourishes the soul." You might say the monks invented mindfulness centuries before it became a wellness trend. Their dining rituals weren't meant to be rigid or joyless. They were attempts to harmonize body and spirit. Just as their prayers marked the passing of time, their meals marked a sacred pause and offering, a reset, a silence between the chapters of the day, and this rhythm extended even into the kitchen. The monks who prepared the food, usually 2 at a time, rotated weekly, were not mere cooks. They were called kitcheners, and their work was considered as holy as copying scripture or tending the sick. They rose early, planned meals with care, and worked in total silence, often communicating through signs or small chalk marks on wooden slates. They were taught to stir slowly, to bake bread as if shaping a reliquary, and to remember that they fed not just bodies, but souls. Imagine that, every slice of bread cut with intention, every ladle of soup poured with prayer. Waste was forbidden. Leftovers were minimal, and if any remained, they were given to the poor at the monastery gate or used to feed the animals. Composting wasn't environmentalism, it was reverence. It's easy to romanticize this life, especially through the lens of modern stress. But it wasn't always serene. There were days when the soup was scorched or the bread underbaked, when novices forgot the sign for cheese or someone sneezed during the blessing. There were moments of grumbling, exhaustion, and even boredom. But these were not failures. They were part of the practice. The meal was never about perfection. It was about presence. And so in the silence, in the slow ticking of a sundial, or the flickering of a beeswax candle, the monks found something most of us spend our lives chasing, a moment that wasn't just quiet, but enough. The monasteries of medieval Europe have crumbled, been repurposed, or simply faded into quiet stone ruins. The great scriptoriums where monks copied parchment by candlelight are now visited by tourists and studied by historians. But the practice of silent dining surprisingly has not vanished. It endured across centuries of plague, revolution, reformations, and industrial explosions. The quiet meals of monastic life continued in small corners of the world, steady, modest, and often unnoticed. Let's travel forward now. It's the 14th century. The Black Death arrives in Europe like a nightmare wrapped in fog. Between 1347 and 1351, devastates the population, claiming up to 60% in some regions. Entire villages vanish, fields go unplowed, cities smell of fear. Monasteries were no exception. Many monastic communities suffered catastrophic losses. Some were completely wiped out, their abbots and novices alike buried in shallow graves. The silence of death replaced the silence of discipline. And yet, in scattered pockets, life went on. In abbeys that escaped the worst, the structure of prayer and meal remained a comfort, an anchor in chaos. Surviving monks noted in their chronicles how the rhythm of the divine office and, even, the shared meal helped them make sense of the senseless. One Carthusian monk, writing in 1350, recorded, "Though death beat at the door, we kept our table in silence. Bread, broth, prayer, and stillness. We did not flee, we did not shout, we listened to the Lord, and we chewed slowly." That sentence has stayed with scholars for centuries, not for its theology, but for its humanity. The monks were not untouched by grief. But the act of gathering in silence, even over a bowl of lentils, was a ritual of resilience. In some ways, the silence helped them mourn without being overwhelmed. But silent dining wasn't just a medieval relic surviving on fumes of tradition. It adapted. When the printing press exploded onto the European scene in the 15th century, literacy began to expand outside monastery walls. The reading of scripture and philosophy, once confined to Latin-speaking monks, spread to merchants, scholars, and secular scholars, and even artisans. Refectory reader, once the central voice at mealtimes, now had an audience both inside and outside the cloister. Monasteries began printing their own reading materials, tailored to their community's spiritual focus, some with guides for what to read during lunch in Lent, or Eastertide, or the Feast of St. Benedict. Some orders introduced soft chanting. During meals, others encouraged meditation on printed prayer cards. A few even adopted music lessons as a quiet auditory substitute, especially in novice training halls, where new brothers were taught humility not just by labor but by listening. Time marched on. During the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, many monasteries were shuttered or ceased, especially in England and parts of Germany. Monks were driven out, libraries were burned, and refectories were converted into manors or stables. Yet again, some communities clung on in the Alps, in the forests of France, and in hidden corners of Spain. The Trappists, a particularly austere offshoot of the Cistercians, became the standard bearers of silent living. Their meals were even stricter. No reading, no music, just presence. By the 18th century, Enlightenment philosophers were mocking monks as outdated, cloistered relics of the past. Silence, they argued, was ignorance. Speech was reason. Debate was enlightenment. And yet, deep in the folds of Normandy or in the valleys of the Swiss Jura, monks still chewed their porridge. In silence, even as cities grew louder, filled with bells, carts, industry, an argument, the abbey dining room remained a place where noise did not win. Some say it was stubbornness, others say it was faith. Perhaps it was a third thing, something like wisdom. In the 19th century, monastic life saw a quiet revival. Romantic poets, Catholic reformers, and even secular scholars began to revalue silence. They saw in the monastic tradition a counterbalance to modernity's rush. Writers like Thomas Merton and philosophers like Kierkegaard would later reflect on monastic silence not as repression, but as liberation, a way to hear oneself think, a refusal to fill every moment with noise. And what about today? Silent dining still exists. All over the world, it's not just in remote abbeys, but in modern settings. The Trappist monks found in France, Belgium, the us and beyond continue the tradition. In their dining halls, you will still find long wooden tables, bowls of soup, and no conversation. The same silence, the same awareness, and they are not alone. Zen monasteries in Japan practice similar meal rituals called arayoki, with astonishing parallels. Quiet, methodical eating, no talk, deep gratitude, attention to every bite. Even the washing of the bowl is ceremonial. In India, Jain monks and certain Buddhist lineages share in this quiet reverence around food. In Orthodox Christian monasticism, particularly on Mount Athos in Greece, meals are often accompanied by readings from the Desert Fathers, an echo of the old Western custom. Across traditions, across continents, the same idea has survived. Food is sacred. Silence is sacred. Together they form a kind of liturgy. And now, perhaps most surprisingly, silent dining has begun to trickle into secular life. In recent years, silent retreats have exploded in popularity. People pay hundreds or thousands of dollars to sit in silence, eat in silence, and reflect without distraction. What was once called asceticism is now rebranded as mindfulness. Some cafes in urban centers like Berlin, San Francisco, and Kyoto offer silent lunch hours. Phones off, no talking, just eating. Slowly, respectfully. One New York Times writer described the experience like this: I tasted my food for the first time in a year. Not just the spice, but the shape, the temperature. I realized how much noise I eat through. In an age of constant input, podcasts, tweets, meetings, streaming the monk's habit of attentive eating feels strangely radical, and it turns out you don't have to wear robes or chant in Latin to do it. The core of the practice is very simple. Sit, breathe, eat slowly, don't speak. That's it. You don't need a monastery. A corner of your home will do. A park bench, a silent car ride with a sandwich, a dinner where no one checks their phone or tries to impress. You don't even need soup. The silence is enough. When we look back now at those long stone tables, in Cistercian abbeys or Benedictine cloisters, we aren't just seeing history, we're seeing continuity. A 1,500-year experiment in what happens when people remove words from the mouth and let the food do the talking. Perhaps the monks were not trying to be mysterious or holy or self-denying. Perhaps they were simply saying, this is enough. Right. Here, this bite, this moment, this silence. And in that, they found a kind of feast that no banquet could match. You've wandered through the hedgerows with your woven skeps and crouched at the buzzing mouth of the hive. But now, dear listener, it is time to step deeper into the curious and orderly world inside the hive itself, a world that mirrored, in surprising ways, the feudal structures and spiritual convictions of the medieval society around it. To understand the beekeeper of the Middle Ages, you must not only watch his hands and his bees, you must also understand how he thought about the bees. Bees as models of Christian community. Medieval people didn't just keep bees, they venerated them. To the eyes of a 13th century monk or farmer, the bee colony was no random gathering of insects, it was a divine microcosm. Bees were seen as disciplined, orderly, and purpose-driven. Unlike humans, who might gossip or laze, bees seemed tireless. Each played their part for the good of the whole. No one wasted effort. They lived in harmony. And they produced a miraculous, incorruptible food, honey. Clerics often invoked bees in sermons. St. John Chrysostom likened monks to bees, flitting from flower to flower, gathering virtue. Others compared the church to a hive with bishops and abbots as wise queens, though. Male, interestingly, and the monks as faithful workers. And the Virgin Mary. She was associated with the purity of beeswax used in all ecclesiastical candles, never mixed with animal fat or tallow. Honey, after all, was more than food. It was a symbol, taste of Eden, a golden gift from a moral. God-fearing insect. But beliefs about bees also included some less saintly elements. The queen bee, king, or Christ. Modern readers may be surprised to learn that, for much of medieval Europe, people believed bee colonies were ruled not by a queen, but by a king. This was not simply a mistake of observation. It was theology in action. Aristotle had once written of a king bee, and medieval writers, especially those influenced by classical texts, doubled down on the idea. They could not accept that such an orderly, productive society would be led by a female. The idea of female rule, especially over males, seemed not only incorrect but unnatural. It clashed with the gender hierarchies of their world. Even when beekeepers could observe that the ruler bee was larger and did not mate in the hive, they maintained the fiction. They simply didn't see what they didn't expect to see. And so the idea of the bee king became common, majestic, celibate, and central to hive order. Some writers went further, comparing the bee king to Christ himself, who led without violence and was the source of unity. In truth, the idea of a queen bee wouldn't gain traction until the 17th century, when scientists with microscopes and fewer theological hang-ups began documenting actual bee reproduction. The idea that the king was in fact a fertile queen came as a shock, but back in medieval times, the imagined hierarchy of the hive reflected the imagined hierarchy of society itself. Bee superstitions, swarming souls, and speaking to the hive. It would be misleading to suggest that medieval beekeepers were purely scientific or theological. In truth, many straddled the line between practical skill and folk superstition. Bees were mysterious. Their sudden swarms, their communal deaths, and their ability to vanish or thrive, these could not always be explained. One of the most curious traditions across Europe was the practice of telling the bees. When a beekeeper died, it was vital to approach the hives and inform the bees of their master's passing. Failing to do so might lead the bees to swarm, abandon the hive, or even die. The ritual varied. In England, someone off in the widow would tap gently on the hive and whisper the news, "Your master is dead." Sometimes the hives would be draped in black cloth. In parts of France, they were offered wine. In Germany, they were asked to stay and serve the new master. This wasn't just a quaint custom. Bees were thought to have a soul-like awareness of their keeper's fate. To neglect their grief was to court disaster. Some even believed that bees could carry souls, or that their mysterious hum was a kind of murmured prayer. House en masse, it might herald a coming death. And if a hive flourished unexpectedly, it could signal a blessing. Swarming. A gift and a threat. Swarming was both a beekeeper's dream and nightmare. When a healthy hive grew too large, part of it would break away, thousands of bees taking to the sky in a whirling golden cloud to found a new colony. If caught in time, this swarm could be collected and housed in a new skep. More bees meant more honey. More honey meant more candles, food, and salves. But if missed, the swarm could vanish into the woods or worse, settle in a neighbor's thatch, prompting bitter disputes. In some places, laws had to be passed, clarifying who had claim to swarming bees, the original owner or the one who captured them. Priests sometimes blessed hives to prevent swarming. Others rang bells or made smoke to calm the bees and coax them into new homes. In Bavaria, people sang hymns to them. In parts of Wales, bees were told fairy tales to make them stay. In the bees' mysterious decisions, people saw signs. Perhaps it was God's will, or perhaps it was the bees' own secret wisdom. Legal rights and bee crimes, believe it or not, there were bee-related legal codes. In Charlemagne's capitularies, the royal laws of the Frankish Empire, honey theft was a crime. In some cases, stolen bees had to be returned with compensation. Hives could be willed to heirs, just like sheep or land. There are records of monastic disputes over bee rights. One apiary might accuse another of luring away bees with sweeter flowers or unlawfully enticing swarms. Entire communities depended on apiaries. A single lost hive could mean no candles for mass or no salve for winter sores. Bees were not just bugs. They were assets. And bee mismanagement, like letting hives die or allowing swarms to settle on forbidden land, could lead to real-world consequences. It's easy to forget now just how embedded bees were in medieval life. In a world before sugar, honey was not a treat, it was sweetness itself. In a world lit only by flame, beeswax wasn't a luxury, it was sacred light. And so the beekeeper was both farmer and guardian of a kind of buzzing golden mystery. But what about the bees themselves? How were they actually kept day to day? What tools did the beekeeper use? How did he harvest the honey? And what happened when the harvest went wrong? You've seen their myths and meanings. Now it's time to step into the skep, to taste the sweetness and the sting of the beekeeper's labor. If you are still awake, you've already learned how deeply bees buzzed through the medieval imagination, from saintly metaphors to whispered superstitions. But the keeper's work wasn't all theology and folklore. It was, at its heart, a quiet, careful, and sometimes dangerous labor. The life of a beekeeper was one of patience, observation, and deep attentiveness to the rhythm of nature. Let's now step into the bee's real world, the earthy, grassy world of wax and wings. The tools of the trade forget modern wooden boxes and tidy frames. The medieval beekeeper's primary hive was the skepa, tightly coiled dome of straw bound. Together with brambles or blackberry vines, these hives were lightweight, durable, and could be crafted from the local field. Often shaped like an upside-down bowl, they had no movable parts. Once the bees were inside, the structure was sealed except for a small entrance hole near the bottom. In much of Europe, skeps were perched on stone slabs to protect them from damp ground. Sometimes under thatched eaves or in small wooden shelters known as bee bowls niches in stone walls, designed to cradle hives safely out of reach of predators. To tend the hive, the beekeeper had just a few tools, perhaps a curved knife to scrape wax, a woven veil of linen to protect the face, and, most importantly, smoke. Bee smoke wasn't just a deterrent. It was a soft lullaby. When exposed to smoke, bees instinctively gorge on honey, preparing for a potential evacuation. Gorged and sluggish, they become less aggressive. The beekeeper could then inspect the hive or, when necessary, collect honey with a lower risk of stings. Medieval smoke came from smoldering turf, dried herbs like thyme, or even animal dung. Some keepers believed certain smokes calmed bees more effectively. Others believed bees liked sweet talk better than smoke and would hum songs or speak gently. While working the harvest, a violent sweetness here is where the beekeeper's story becomes less golden. Harvesting honey from a medieval skep was more often than not a destructive process. Without movable combs or modern extractors, keepers had little choice. To collect the honey, they usually had to kill the bees. The most common method? Sulfur smoke.
Gloss.
Soaked in sulfur would be lit and placed in a pit. The skep would be inverted above the fumes, and in minutes, the hive would fall still. The keeper would then cut away the comb, separating dark brood comb from golden honeycomb. The wax would be boiled and strained. Honey would be poured through cloth into ceramic jugs. There were alternatives. Some keepers tried to save part of the hive, collecting only outer combs or using split hive methods that allowed bees to repopulate. But these techniques were rare and risky. A failed hive meant no harvest. Most medieval beekeepers chose surety over mercy. It is one of the sadder ironies of the trade. To taste the sweetness, one often had to destroy the very source. The keeper's calendar, the beekeeper's year, moved with the sun. In spring, hives were watched for signs of swarming. Bee colonies, fat from overwintering stores, often grew restless. The keeper would walk among the skeps, watching for that telltale hum and flight that meant a new colony was forming. With quick hands and a practiced ear, he might catch the swarm in a basket or coax it into an empty hive. Miss it and the bees might vanish for good. Summer was the season of bloom and building. Fields of clover and heather called to the foragers. Bees flew miles each day, returning with full pollen baskets and bellies of nectar. The keeper ensured water was nearby, and hives remained shaded. He might even place flower-scented water or herbs nearby to encourage local gathering. By late summer and autumn, the harvest began. Honey and wax were collected, and any wheat colonies were culled or merged. In colder regions, the keeper might wrap the skeps in straw or linen to keep out frost. But many hives did not survive winter cold. Damp or disease could wipe them out silently. And then in winter, the keeper waited. There was little to be done but pray the bees would make it through. In some places, hymns were sung at Christmas time, just for the hives. Bees were thought to hum along, celebrating the birth of Christ. In their own quiet way, beeswax and the sacred flame wax was nearly as precious as honey. In monasteries, churches, and noble households, beeswax was the gold of the candle chest. Unlike animal tallow which stank, smoked, and sputtered, beeswax burned clean. It was required for mass, for processions, for royal funerals, and for holy rites. In a dark world, beeswax gave sacred light. Some churches kept bees themselves. Others contracted with local beekeepers to supply wax. Payment might be made in coin, grain, or even wine. In larger abbeys, monks might work their own hives, crafting tall candles for cathedral altars. The process was slow. Wax comb was melted, strained through linen, and shaped using carved wooden molds. The result was not only light, but purity symbolic of divine truth. In this way, The beekeeper's humble labors were connected, however distantly, to the rituals of kings and saints. Quiet occupation, a buzzing legacy, the medieval beekeeper rarely earned fame. He didn't joust or ride into war. He didn't sing ballads or wear embroidered tunics. But he shaped his world in sweeter, quieter ways, gave light to churches, balm to wounds, and sweetness to peasant tables. He walked among the flowers and heard the language of wings. He told stories. To the hives and read the sky for signs. He watched life rise and fall in tiny golden nations. He kept time not with clocks, but with blossoms. He moved not with armies, but with the hum of flight. And when he passed, someone would go to the hives and whisper, "Your master is gone." The bees might stay or swarm, but the work would continue. For as long as there are flowers and sun, bees will build. And where they build, someone quiet and careful will come to tend them. Somewhere under layers of cobblestone and centuries of dust lies a footprint, maybe from a soldier's sandal or a tired mule's hoof. It's faded now, lost in the crush of time, but once it was part of a rhythm, a movement, a system of such scale and subtlety that it knit together thousands of miles into one humming empire. Tonight, we leave behind the buzzing hives and whispering monks and follow a new thread, one that winds its way across craggy hills, dry valleys, and shaded forests. It's the story of a road, or rather, many roads. Roads were built not just for war or trade, but for something quieter and, in its own way, more revolutionary: mail. Before smartphones, before couriers on bicycles, or the clack of a telegraph. Before even the parchment-bound scribes of medieval Europe, there was the cursus publicus, the official postal service of the Roman Empire. Yes, the Romans, with all their battles and baths and bronze statues, also had a postal network. A complex, state-run system of way stations, relay riders, wax-sealed scrolls, and dusty travel permits. It was a slow, sturdy heartbeat beneath the imperial skin, pulsing from the Atlantic coasts of Hispania to the deserts of Syria. And if you listen closely, somewhere beneath the soft murmur of sleep, you might still hear the echo of hooves and sandals on gravel. A network for an empire, the Roman road system was legendary. Over 250,000 miles of roads, 50,000 of them paved with stone. And while many of these roads were built for moving troops and supplies, they quickly served another purpose: communication. At the height of the empire, information needed to move as swiftly as soldiers. An edict from the emperor in Rome might have to reach a governor in Alexandria or a legion in Britannia. And so, in the 1st century BCE, Augustus, the same Augustus who stabilized Rome after Caesar's death, created the cursus publicus. The name means public course or public run. And it was essentially the Roman Empire's version of a federal postal system, designed not for the masses, but for imperial business. Private letters were common. Sure, wealthy Romans had their own slaves or messengers carry correspondence. But the cursus publicus was official. It moved military orders, diplomatic messages, census reports, and tax documents. It was the postal spine of an empire that stretched from rainy Britannia to sun-baked Arabia, the way stations. Mutatio and Mancio, but how? You might wonder, did letters move so far, so fast? The secret lay in a chain of carefully spaced stations known as mutations and mansionese. A mutatio, literally change, was a humble place, a fumble place, a little more than a stable and a shed, where riders could swap tired horses for fresh ones. These were placed roughly every 8 to 12 miles. Their job was to keep the message moving. A relay system, horse to horse, rider to rider, hour by hour. A mancio, from the word manere, to stay, was more substantial. Located every 20 to 30 miles, these were overnight stops. They had food, beds, stables, and sometimes even baths. Yeah. Official on imperial business might rest here before continuing the next day. Some were small villas. Others, especially on busy routes, grew into roadside settlements. These way stations were staffed, supplied, and maintained by tax revenue, local communities, or regional governors. And their presence marked the importance of the message being carried. It wasn't quite the Pony Express. It wasn't FedEx, but it worked. Letters could travel over 50 miles a day across the backbone of the empire. The permit to send to use the cursus publicus, you needed permission specifically, a diploma. Now, don't imagine a graduation scroll. This diploma was a wooden tablet, bound with cords and sealed in wax, signed by the emperor or one of his officials. It granted the bearer the right to use state horses to access way stations and to travel official roads. If you were a governor, a general, or a tax collector, you had one. If you were an ambitious merchant or a noblewoman managing estates, you might request one through patronage. The diploma wasn't just a license, it was a passport, a key, a privilege. And while some forged them, yes, forgery existed even then. Most were tightly controlled. In fact, we still have a few today, delicate tablets inscribed with the names of users, scratched by stylus onto soft wax 2 millennia ago. Messages on wax and scroll. As for the messages themselves, they came in many forms. The most common was the wax tablet, 2 wooden panels bound together, their interiors filled with dark beeswax. A stylus scratched words into the wax. The tablet could then be closed and sealed shut. For longer messages or more formal correspondence, papyrus scrolls were used. Imported from Egypt and expensive, these were reserved for serious affairs, military, orders, senatorial decrees, or imperial commands. A single letter might be accompanied by guards. Some messengers traveled in pairs, one to read, the other to carry. In certain emergencies, they rode day and night, switching horses at each mutation, racing to the next mancio, bringing news of war, rebellion, or triumph. And when they arrived, dusty, weary, and saddle-sore, the recipient might unseal the wax, read the message, and dispatch a new rider in return. A silent, steady pulse, the cursus publicus, was not dramatic. It wasn't filled with heroes or battles, but it was essential. It kept the empire coherent, carried census data that fed tax rolls, delivered military instructions that held borders together, passed along intelligence reports, construction permits, property disputes, and requests for grain shipments. And most of the time, it worked. Even as Rome faltered, the postal roads endured. In some places, way stations became towns. In others, old roadbeds guided medieval pilgrims, then modern railways. You can still walk parts of the Via Appia, the Via Flaminia, or the Via Ignatia. And somewhere, just beneath your foot, might be the ghostly trail of a Roman postal rider galloping on through the centuries. Beneath the endless sun of a Roman summer, a rider crested a ridge. Dust clung to the folds of his tunic. His eyes, shaded by a simple cap, scanned the road ahead, a pale ribbon, cutting across hills and wheat fields. Behind him lay 40 miles of hard riding. Ahead, another mutation waited with a fresh horse, a gulp of wine, and perhaps a warning about the weather. He carried no sword, no coin pouch, no flag, only a wooden case bound in leather tucked carefully into a satchel. Inside, it were 2 wax tablets and 1 rolled papyrus, orders from the emperor. This was the life of the Roman postal courier, not glamorous, not heroic, but essential, and far more complicated than you might expect. The postman always rings twice. The men of the cursus publicus weren't ordinary travelers. They were stationary dispatch. Riders trained to ride long distances, often alone or in pairs, and responsible not just for delivering messages, but for gathering news, watching roads, and reporting irregularities. Some wore uniforms, though modest ones. More often, they bore insignia, official tokens or symbols stamped into tablets, badges, or belts. These symbols identified them as agents of the empire. Interfering with them, even by accident, could be punished as a crime. Their lives were lived on horseback. Their beds, often in mansionese or the corners of bustling taverns. They developed thick thighs, weathered skin, and an intimate knowledge of the roads between mountains and marshes, cities and coastlines. And they carried time itself, not hours or minutes, but the empire's sense of urgency. A late message could mean famine. A delay could mean mutiny. They didn't race for profit. They rode for cohesion, for unity, for empire. Keeping secrets. Postal security in ancient times, but how do you keep imperial secrets safe when your roads stretch for thousands of miles? Here the Romans were surprisingly thoughtful. Messages of importance were often sealed in wax, stamped with official signet, rings. If the seal was broken, the recipient would know. If the seal was forged, well, that was treason. Some messages were written in code knot, the kind we use today. But simple substitution ciphers are intentionally obscure phrasing. A commander might refer to a region by a nickname or write dates in an unfamiliar calendar. In a few documented cases, messages were even written in invisible ink milk or lemon juice that would only appear when heated near a flame. Later, Roman spies adopted this technique more widely, but most often, security came from trust and layers of protocol. The courier was only part of the chain. Messages were logged at way stations. Some were copied and archived en route. Others required a verbal password from the bearer before they could be accepted. A Roman general in Dacia wouldn't just open any scroll. He'd examine the seal, check the courier's insignia, and confirm the delivery with his local stationarius-like. A sleepy, ancient version of two-factor authentication. What did the Romans write about? Not everything was a war report or tax instruction. The cursus publicus carried a strange variety of correspondence, mundane, political, practical, and occasionally personal. We know this because archaeologists have recovered fragments of Roman letters, mostly from Vindolanda, Roman fort near Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain. These Vindolanda tablets, written on thin wood and ink, offer a snapshot of Roman life around 100 CE. Some are military memos. Others are shopping lists. But a few are as human and timeless as any text message. I invite you, sister, to my birthday celebration. It will be modest wine, bread, and laughter. Or send more socks. The last ones were full of holes. And winter is coming quickly, Lise. These letters may not have traveled by official post, but they mirror what the imperial service enabled. The movement of thought, request, and sentiment across astonishing distances. Imagine it. A senator in Rome asking for grain inventories from Tunisia. A Roman commander in Gaul reporting on cavalry movements. A governor in Asia Minor submitting tax rolls, all bound together by scribes, seals, and horses. The unsung labor behind the letters, it's easy to imagine the system as clean, efficient, and orderly. But behind every mile of road was a host of invisible labor. Local communities were often obligated to maintain roads and supply stations. These obligations were part of what the Romans called muneracivic duties that weren't optional. A town near a mansion might have to provide food, repairs, and staff even when the empire's funds ran thin. Station workers, stable hands, cooks, and scribes all labored behind the scenes. Many were free, some enslaved, and others semi-voluntary locals trying to earn favor or protect their families. In snow or rain, in times of plague or rebellion, the work continued. Travelers might grumble, horses might collapse, way stations sometimes ran out of oats or dried meat. But still, messages moved, slowly, surely, and above all, consistently. Quiet messages, loud impacts. The power of the Roman postal system wasn't in its speed, it was in its reach. It was reliable, predictable. And in an empire where chaos was always just a rebellion or bad harvest away, that reliability was gold. Thanks to these messages, roads were repaired before floods washed them away. Armies received their winter clothing just in time. Censuses were tabulated, and taxes were levied more or less accurately. Governors stayed connected to the will of Rome, even on distant frontiers. And in quieter corners, in places like Vindolanda, birthday invitations and sock requests slipped into the mix, riding along the same roads. In that way, the cursus publicus was a skeleton key to Roman civilization, not glamorous, not heroic, but utterly essential. By the time the sun set on the height of the Roman Empire, its postal roads stretched farther than most of its citizens could imagine. From the windswept highlands of northern Britain to the sun-baked villages of Syria, The cursus publicus linked governors, legions, merchants, and messengers in a thread of disciplined motion. But like many Roman inventions, the system was only as strong as the empire itself, and empires, no matter how grand, are always just one frayed thread from unraveling. A slower decline than you think. Historians once assumed that the Roman postal system collapsed quickly, disintegrating alongside the legions and cities that once depended on it. But archaeological evidence suggests something quieter. It's not a crash. A soft fade, a gentle unraveling stretched across centuries. Even as central authority weakened in the 3rd and 4th century CE, many Mantianese and mutations continued to operate. Local authorities stepped in. Bishops began using the stations. Merchants and pilgrims followed the same roads, often riding the same horses and stopping at the same wells once maintained by imperial order. The infrastructure didn't disappear. It outlasted the empire. Because when a road is good, people keep using it. Ghosts on the roads. By the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire had fractured into a patchwork of kingdoms, warlords, and fading titles. Yet, reports survive of messengers still riding Roman roads, sometimes bearing imperial seals, sometimes not, through regions no longer clearly Roman. In the Eastern Empire, based in Constantinople, the system endured even longer. Byzantine emperors used variations of the cursus publicus well into the 7th century. Roads were repaired, horses provided, orders issued, but the tone had changed. There was more distrust, more corruption, more intercepts. The idea of a single, unified empire communicating cleanly across 3 continents had become quaint. Even so, the bones of the system lingered. Riders still galloped across the Balkans and Anatolia. Dust still rose on forgotten paths. Some roads were renamed. Others simply vanished beneath weeds and earth. And still others were absorbed by new civilizations. The roads live on. Many of the postal roads, built or improved by the Romans, would become the foundations of modern highways. In France, Britain, Italy, and parts of the Middle East, archaeologists and engineers have uncovered Roman roadbeds beneath modern asphalt. The Via Appia, once a marvel of Roman engineering, is still partially walkable in southern Italy. In Britain, the straight-line logic of Roman surveying still shapes local roads. Towns with names ending in Chester or Castor often grew up around Roman forts once, linked by postal couriers galloping between outposts. And in the medieval world, monks, merchants, and kings adapted the remnants of the cursus publicus to their own needs. Monasteries grew near abandoned mansionese, their gardens blooming in the same courtyards where horses once rested. Medieval pilgrims followed Roman routes on their way to Compostela or Canterbury. Traders carried spices and letters along roads the legions had built. By the time Renaissance scholars began studying ancient texts, the postal system was already a legend, but one grounded in stone, in dust, in still walkable paths through oak and olive groves. Echoes in today's systems in many ways. Our modern communication infrastructure echoes what the Romans built: networks built on reliability, distance, and central control. Our government post systems, born from royal and ecclesiastical messengers, but inspired by Roman bureaucracy, our highway numbering systems, rooted in the Roman preference for central hubs like Rome with radiating spokes. Even the idea of a postmaster has a Roman ancestor, the curator virum, the overseer of roads and stations. And just like the Roman system, ours are vulnerable not to barbarian invasions, perhaps, but to misinformation, neglect, or overload. The fragility of vast systems remains a lesson worth remembering. One final letter, let's imagine for a moment, a final Roman letter. One never delivered. It sits in a leather case, tucked beneath a stone in the ruins of a mansion somewhere. In North Africa, the wax seal is still intact. The scroll inside, crisp from the desert air. Its message, a simple supply request. 20 pairs of sandals for the 6th cohort in Cyrene, signed by a tribune whose name has long since faded from history. No one will ever read it. But for a moment, picture the courier who left it there. Perhaps he was old, Perhaps the garrison was already gone. Perhaps he waited at the way station for 3 days, 4, and then turned back. The sandals were never sent. But the letter, its neat script, its careful seal still exists. Proof that once people cared enough to send messages across the known world, trusting roads, riders, and time. And so the Roman postal roads slipped into history not in a blaze, but in dust and hoofbeats, in cracked milestones and fading ink. Yet if you listen closely, walking a quiet country lane in Italy or France or even Tunisia, you might still hear the ghost of a galloping horse. A whisper of a message once carried across an empire. Not urgent, not dramatic, just enduring. When we imagine the Middle Ages, we tend to think of the clatter of swords, the chanting of monks, or the clang of blacksmiths in foggy towns. But for many medieval Europeans, one sound was more constant than all the others, the soft, rhythmic toll of bells marking a death. Not a battle cry, not a coronation, just the solemn peal that echoed from every cathedral and village chapel whenever someone passed away. And for those still living, it was a reminder not of terror, but of preparation. Because in the Middle Ages, dying well wasn't just a hope, it was a skill. A guidebook for the final journey somewhere in the early 15th century as Europe recovered from the trauma of the Black Death and stumbled through the 100 Years' War. A new kind of book quietly began to circulate in monasteries and towns. Its name was Ars Moriendi, Latin for the art of dying. This wasn't a religious sermon or a philosophical treatise. It was in many ways a self-help manual for your final moments. Beautifully illustrated and widely translated, the Ars Moriendi guided Christians through what to expect as they approached death and how to prepare their soul with calm, grace, and dignity. Think of it as the medieval version of a hospice guide, written not by doctors, but by monks, scribes, and theologians. Why was such a book needed? The 14th and 15th centuries were full of upheaval. The Black Death had swept through Europe in the 1340s, killing an estimated third to half of the population. Entire villages were wiped out. Families buried multiple generations in a single week. Plague didn't follow the polite customs of courtly life. It came suddenly and left bodies behind before last rites could be given. And so the church responded not with panic, but with structure. The Ars Moriendi arose as an answer to a haunting question. What happens if you can't get a priest when you're dying? For a devout medieval person, dying without confession or final communion could mean an eternity in purgatory or worse. The book offered reassurance. If you knew the steps, if you prayed the right words, if you fought off the right temptations, you could die well, even alone. It was comfort wrapped in ritual. The 5 great temptations, the Ars Moriendi, laid out a dramatic framework for the spiritual battles that occurred on a deathbed. According to the text, a dying person would face 5 major temptations, each one dangerous to the soul, lack of faith, doubting God or divine justice in your final hour, despair believing your sins are too great to be forgiven, impatience becoming angry at your suffering, your caretakers, or even at God, pride believing your own works, not God's mercy, will save you, greed clinging to earthly possessions, or refusing to make restitution. Each temptation was paired with a counter-virtue. For example, to fight despair. The book encouraged hope, reminding the dying person that even the worst sinners could be saved through sincere contrition. This wasn't theology for scholars. It was spiritual medicine for everyone, from knights and widows to peasants and monks. Picture books for the dying. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Ars Moriendi was its use of illustrations known as block books, which helped illiterate people understand the spiritual struggle. In a typical woodcut, you might see a man lying on a bed, demons whispering in one ear, offering him a crown symbolizing pride or gold symbolizing greed, angels countering in the other ear, gently reminding him of Christ's sacrifice or the peace of heaven. Each scene depicted a moral choice. These images were not just meant for the dying. Families gathered around them, watching and learning. Children absorbed the lessons through pictures. Even those too poor to own books might see the images carved into church panels or painted on chapel walls. The message was clear. Death comes for all, but dying well is an art form, a final act of courage and humility. not about fear, despite its grim subject. The tone of the Ars Moriendi is surprisingly calm, even tender. There is no screaming damnation, no vivid threats of eternal fire. Instead, the dying person is treated like a weary traveler who needs guidance. Caregivers are told to speak gently, to remind the dying of Christ's mercy, and to offer hope rather than scolding. At a time when war, plague, and famine could strike at any moment, this approach was profoundly radical. It told people, you are not alone. Even at your last breath, you are part of a spiritual community. There is a way to pass through this with beauty, with peace. A communal moment unlike modern death, which often occurs in sterile hospital rooms. Medieval death was usually a public communal event. When someone neared death, neighbors were called. Family gathered. Priest, if available, came with oils and sacraments. Children watched quietly. Servants wept. The deathbed became a holy space and emotional classroom. And in the center of it all, the dying person, armed with the Ars Moriendi, performed their final task. They forgave debts. They confessed old sins. They whispered prayers. They asked for water. They looked out the window one last time, and if they had strength, they might speak a final blessing. The Ars Moriendi was the script for a good death. Then the people at the bedside were the supporting castiche, playing a quiet but vital role in the performance of a proper medieval farewell. Unlike modern funerals where grief comes after death, the medieval goodbye began before the final breath. And it wasn't just about mourning. It was about spiritual choreography, an intricate dance of prayer, ritual, forgiveness, and memory, all unfolding as time seemed to slow in the dying person's room. The caretaker's role? Gentle coaching toward heaven in many medieval homes. Someone had memorized parts of the Ars Moriendi, or kept a copy nearby. Sometimes it was a family member, other times a parish nurse, a monk, or a lay brother trained. In comforting the dying, these caregivers weren't doctors, they were soul guides. Their job was not to cure, but to comfort, to gently help the dying person walk that narrow path between spiritual fear and peaceful surrender. They read prayers aloud. They reminded the dying not to fall into despair. They repeated comforting phrases like, "Think of Christ who died for thee. Fear not, the Lord is merciful. Remember thy baptism and rejoice." If that person seemed anxious, they encouraged a final confession. If the person faltered, they reminded them of heaven. And when the time came, they said the commendation of the soul, whispering, "Go forth, Christian soul," a phrase meant to guide the soul gently away from the body, like a sailor untying the last mooring rope before a ship leaves shore. Community is witness, unlike the private, hospital-bound deaths we often see today. Medieval death was almost always public, not as a spectacle, but as a shared duty. It wasn't uncommon for neighbors to drop what they were doing and gather at a dying person's bedside, especially if they were elderly or important in the community. Children watched, sometimes nervously. Elders mumbled prayers. Friends offered apologies, returned borrowed tools, or forgave debts, allowed wanting to clear accounts before death sealed things permanently. And then there was singing. Always singing. Simple hymns, psalms, even lullabies, sung as if to soothe the soul, like a child going to sleep. Practical affairs of the soul. In between prayers and hymns, there were often practical matters to attend to. People used their final moments to make bequests. "Give this cloak to my cousin." Right wrongs. "Tell Margaret I'm sorry I never repaid her kindness." Arrange guardianship. "Let the abbot raise my salt and give him my psalter." These moments weren't transactional, they were profoundly moral. In fact, failure to settle debts, apologize, or confess wrongdoings before death could weigh heavily on a person's mind and on their community's conscience. Many believed that an unsettled soul might linger as a ghost or bring misfortune. Even a humble peasant might summon a priest and 2 witnesses, whispering, "I forgive the man who took my pig. I was angry, but let it be." Death is a social equalizer. Death was one of the few things in medieval society that treated peasants and kings the same. Sure, a nobleman might die in a silk-draped bed with relics and choirs present, while a farmer died on straw with a single candle flickering. But the ritual, the spiritual drama was strikingly similar. Everyone, regardless of rank, had to prepare their soul, face their temptations, and die with dignity. Even monarchs carried personal copies of the Ars Moriendi. Kings, it was said, feared dying unprepared far more than dying in battle. Some built chapels specifically for the purpose of preparing for death, retreating from court in old age to focus solely on their soul's readiness. Ghosts of the unprepared in popular folklore, the Ars Moriendi was more than a guide, it was protection. Stories circulated in taverns and town squares about those who died without proper ritual. A merchant who cursed the heavens with his last breath, and a woman who clung to her coin pouch and wouldn't let go. Their ghosts, people said, were seen wandering roadsides or sobbing outside the churchyard, trapped between worlds, unfinished, unforgiven. The fear wasn't hellfire. It was limbo, being forgotten, unprayed for, or worse, remembered only for your missteps. To prevent this, even beggars scraped together coins to pay for a simple funeral mass. Communities rallied to bury strangers properly, lest a soul be left wandering. Symbols of transition: when someone passed, their body was prepared in a way that reflected medieval beliefs about death. The eyes were closed so the soul wouldn't be distracted by the world. The mouth was tied shut with a soft cloth to keep it from whispering lies or vanity posthumously. The hands were folded, usually with a small crucifix placed between them. Candle was lit beside the body, sometimes for 3 full days, to guide the soul toward light. Children were taught never to blow out a death candle. It was believed the flame was more than wax, and wicket was a spiritual beacon. The watch, perhaps the most emotionally rich part of a medieval death, was the wake of vigil kept over the body, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. Family, friends, neighbors, and even casual acquaintances would take turns sitting beside the body, praying softly, sometimes even talking to the deceased. They'd say things like, "Your cat still waits by the hearth. The barley is almost ready for harvest. We will tell the children your stories." It wasn't morbid. It was deeply human. The dead were not treated as gone. They were in transition, and it was everyone's job to hold space for that journey. A moment of beauty. Some dying people arranged for music, flowers, or even birds to be brought into the room before death. Not extravagant symbolism. Birds symbolized the soul taking flight. Flowers reminded people of resurrection. Music soothed nerves and slowed breathing like a lullaby before sleep. The point wasn't to escape death. It was to meet it with beauty. In the quiet aftermath of death, medieval people turned their attention not just to burial, but to what came after, for the soul, for the body, and for the living left behind. Death for them was not a sudden full stop, but a process, a journey. The soul continued even after the final breath. And to support that journey, the living worked hard to ensure that the dead were not forgotten. Not just for love, but for practical, spiritual reasons. The funeral as a spiritual send-off. In most medieval communities, a funeral took place within 24 to 48 hours of death. The body was washed, usually by women, and wrapped in a shroud, often made from the person's old linen sheets or a simple woolen cloth. In wealthier households, it might be a silk winding sheet embroidered with prayers. But even the humblest funeral had its rhythm. The procession led by a priest, with the body on a bier, carried through the village, the tolling bell a low, slow rhythm that echoed the phrase, "Remember thou must die." Sprinkling of holy water, a symbol of baptism, a reminder of the soul's cleansing. Chanting of the office of the dead, a haunting melodic chant sung to guide the soul. Final prayers at the graveside, asking God to deliver this soul from the lion's mouth. And then came the earth, 3 shovelfuls, dropped into the grave by the priest, which accompanied by solemn words, "Dust to dust, ashes to ashes." The graveyard as a living place. Medieval cemeteries were not remote, fenced-in areas. They were right next to the church, in the center of village life. People walked through them daily. Children played near the gravestones. Farmers rested. On tombs and on holy days, the community would gather there, treating the space not as a place of fear but of memory. Many believed that the dead could hear prayers said near their graves and might even help the living in return, interceding with God or delivering dreams of comfort or advice. Some headstones had carvings of tools, animals, or book symbols of the dead person's life and work. And on All Souls' Day, candles were placed on every grave, flickering like stars fallen to earth. Masses for the dead, prayers. As currency after the funeral, the real work of remembrance began. Families would pay for masses to be said in honor of the deceased. Each mass was believed to help the soul move faster through purgatory, a place not of punishment but of cleansing, in preparation before heaven. Rich families could afford dozens, sometimes hundreds of masses. Some even left money in their wills to endow chantry small chapels with priests, hired to say daily prayers for their soul forever. This gave rise to what some modern historians call the afterlife economy. But it wasn't cynical. It was deeply sincere. Medieval people believed their prayers helped the dead, and they trusted that one day others would do the same for them. The annual obit in many monasteries and towns, the deceased were commemorated every year on the anniversary of their death. This was called an obit, and it often involved reading the person's name aloud in church, lighting candles in their honor, giving bread or alms to the poor in their name. To forget someone's obit was considered a serious oversight, almost like abandoning them on the road to heaven. Some monasteries kept massive books of remembrance, listing the dead in beautiful calligraphy, with prayers written in the margins. These books were read aloud every week, decade after decade. The cult of the good death by the late medieval period, the ideal of a good death, had become so important that it influenced art, music, and literature. Painters depicted saints dying with peaceful smiles. Poets wrote verses imagining angels carrying souls upward like dandelion seeds. Woodcuts showed skeletons dancing not as horror, but as reminders of life's brevity. There was even a popular image, the dance of death danse macabre, a long line of people from all walks of life, holding hands with grinning skeletons, showing that death came for everyone and did so cheerfully. Rather than frighten, these images reassured people. You are not alone. Everyone dies. The important part is how you live and how you prepare. Comfort for the living, while much of the Ars Moriendi focused on helping the dying, it also offered comfort for those left behind. Books and sermons reminded mourners that grief was natural, but that hope must always follow. They offered these reassurances. The soul is with God and prays for thee. This parting is but for a little while. Death is but the gate, through which all must pass. Widows were encouraged to donate to the poor in memory of their spouses. Children were taught to pray daily for their departed parents. Communities adopted orphans and tended the graves of the lonely. Death, in this way, became a bond, not a break. The eternal conversation in the end, medieval death was not an end at all. It was the beginning of a conversation between the living and the dead, between souls and saints, between time and eternity. The rituals of dying, the prayers of the funeral, the masses, the candles, the obitsa, they were all ways of keeping the departed present, not haunting the world, but inhabiting it softly. Living on through memory, kindness, and daily acts of faith. Even the Ars Moriendi, written in simple Latin and illustrated for all to understand, was part of that legacy. It taught people how to die. But more importantly, it taught them how to live meaningfully in the face of death. Not with fear, but with reverence. Not with dread, but with dignity. In a small village nestled between the Pyrenean foothills and the whispering forests of southern France, something rather odd happened in the spring of 1293. It began, as all curious things do, in a most ordinary way with a hen. A plump, brown-speckled hen that belonged to a widow named Alicende. Alicende, like many women of her age and station, kept chickens not for pleasure, but for survival. Her modest cottage leaned slightly to one side from years of wind and time, and her small coop woven from wicker and patched with reeds housed exactly 5 hens and 1 grumpy old rooster. The hens laid predictably enough, 3 eggs one day to the next, and sometimes none if a storm was brewing. But on this peculiar March morning, Alicende found an egg unlike any she had seen before. It shimmered slightly, not with gold, nor pearl, nor any mineral brilliance. but rather with a kind of inner radiance, like dew lit by dawn. Smooth and pale, but with a faint glow that made it difficult to look away. She blinked, and promptly assumed she needed more sleep. She took the egg inside and set it beside the fire. But when she returned an hour later to boil it, she found something odd. The egg had not cooled. Instead, it was warm again, as though freshly laid. And then she noticed the smell. Not sulfur, not rot, but rosemary and honey. Rumors rise like steam from bread by sundown. The news had traveled down the lane and across the fields. Old Etienne the miller came by, asking questions under the pretense of borrowing kindling. The blacksmith's apprentice made 2 unnecessary deliveries just to get a peek. By evening prayer, the entire village of Saint Celine was murmuring about Alicenne's glowing egg. It would have remained a quaint local oddity, perhaps written off as a trick of the light or a touch of mold, had it not been for what happened the next morning. Alicenne awoke to find her sickly neighbor, a young girl named Perinette, standing at her door. Perinette had suffered for months from an illness that left her weak and coughing, her ribs showing through her tunic. But that morning, she stood, tall, smiling, and without a trace of fever. "I dreamed of your hen," she said simply. She laid a second egg, and when I held it in my hands, I felt full of air, like the illness was a cloak, and someone had pulled it off me. The girl turned, lifted her tunican to Alicenne's astonishment. The red rash on her back, a cruel, blistering ring, had vanished. The pilgrims arrived within a week. Dozens of people had visited the coop. Some left coins, others left bread. A few left shoes, believing the hen might bless them too. And then came the monks, 3 of them from the nearby abbey of St. Loup, bearded and skeptical, with furrowed brows and heavy scrolls. They examined the coop, observed the hen, and questioned Alicenne at length. "You say she lays them only at dawn?" "Yes, father. And they smell always of rosemary, sometimes lavender." They took one of the eggs with them, wrapping it in soft linen and placing it in a small carved box labeled Ove Miraculos. Egg Alicenne expected a reprimand, perhaps even confiscation of her hen. Instead, she received something entirely different. A procession. A holy cluck. On the first Sunday of May, a small but reverent group of pilgrims arrived in Saint Celine. Led by a young abbot named Henry of Valrias, they carried incense, hymns, and a banner embroidered with an image of all things a hen with a golden halo. "Do you mock us?" Alicenne asked him, squinting at the banner. "Quite the opposite," Henry replied. "For in all creation, who are we to say that miracles should limit themselves to saints and kings? The Lord made birds, why not speak through one?" He knelt beside the coop, removed his gloves, and waited. Sure enough, as the rooster crowed and the first light brushed the rooftops, the hen nestled into her straw and laid another glowing egg, this one tinted faintly pink like the shell of a rose. Henry bowed his head. "You must begin a register," he whispered. "We are standing at the site of a holy laying. The chicken is a relic within a month. The hen, now called Blanchefleur, was housed not in a coop, but in a small wooden shrine with a hinged roof and a tiny stained glass window. A local carpenter had carved miniature saints along the edges. In one figure, 8 Brigid, patron of poultry, was given pride of place. Visitors were instructed to approach quietly, whisper a short prayer, and, if they were very lucky, observe the sacred act of laying. Some reported visions, others wept uncontrollably. A merchant from Carcassonne claimed his limping foot was healed after feeding Blanchefleur a handful of oats. A noblewoman, childless for a decade, conceived 2 months after kissing the hens. Egg, a priest from distant Burgundy, left with a single white feather tucked in his psalter. Alicenne's new role, the woman who once struggled to afford salt, now found herself in a different position entirely. People brought her gifts: flour, honey, and fine cloaks. The abbey insisted on regular reports, and she was often consulted. On matters of theology, though, she claimed to understand little beyond feed her at dawn and never startle her. Alicenne refused most donations, saying, "It's not my miracle. I just house it." But she did accept one thing: a small bench carved for her by a grateful widow, so she could sit beside the coop and keep Blanchefleur company through the cool evenings. What had begun as a curiosity soon blossomed into an ecclesiastical conundrum. The Bishop of Béziers, an austere man known for frowning so deeply that local children believed his forehead, at creases shaped like Roman numerals, was not pleased. "A chicken," he muttered, after reading the third letter that described Blanchefleur's miraculous egg-laying. "A chicken, Henry?" "Yes, Your Excellency," replied Abbot Henry, his tone respectful, but unwavering. Her eggs continued to exude a fragrant vapor reminiscent of blessed oils. There had been at least 7 verified healings. The bishop pinched the bridge of his nose. This was not the sort of thing he wanted spreading through the diocese. Not when indulgences were being carefully tallied. Not when 3 new relics bone fragments of St. Theodule had just been installed in his own cathedral, and certainly not when pilgrims were now bypassing the established pilgrimage routes to Santiago and instead clustering around a wooden hen coop in a cottage garden. So the bishop acted. An inquiry from on high in late June, a parchment arrived in St. Celine, sealed with red wax and bearing the intricate insignia of the Holy Curia. A delegation would be dispatched, a canon theologian, a notary incuriously a master of natural philosophy from Montpellier. He arrived with fanfare and skepticism. The canon was thin and dry, his beard forked like the tail of a swallow. The notary, squat and silent, carried an enormous ledger and a quill fashioned from a swan's wing. The philosopher, Master Guillaume, was the most curious both in demeanor and profession. He wore spectacles carved from polished horn and took an immediate interest, not in the hen's eggs, but in her feed. "Do you add herbs?" "No." "Do you chant while she lies?" "I snore, mostly." "Has she been near a relic of Saint Benedict?" "Only once, when that friar tripped in the coop." Guillaume collected a sample of Blanchefleur's droppings in a silver vial and asked to observe her dreams. When Alicende said she wasn't sure hens dreamed, he replied, "All God's creatures dream. That's where the soul stretches." The egg that bled one morning during the delegation's visit? Something strange happened even by Blanchefleur's standards. She laid an egg with a small ruby-colored crack running across its top. The shell was smooth, but the color was unmistakable. It looked like blood had seeped into the egg before it hardened. Alicende crossed herself. The canon scribbled furiously. Master Guillaume sniffed it and declared it smelled of myrrh. Later that day, the egg cracked open not from force, but on its own, revealing not a yolk, but a tiny white feather suspended in a gelatinous amber gel. The notary fainted. The canon muttered something about Visiona's diabola visions of the devil, but Henry saw it differently. "Is not God fond of signs?" he wrote with fire, carved with thunder, and once spoke through a burning bush. Why not throw a brooding hen? The theology of the coop words spread beyond the village, faster than fire and twice as hungry. Scholars began arriving, clutching their scrolls and commentaries. One Dominican friar claimed the hen was a reincarnation of Saint Pelagia, a figure long associated with penitence and divine paradoxes. Franciscan argued it was a living parable god, humbling the learned through a chicken. By midsummer, the theological debate reached Paris, in the faculty halls of the University of Paris. A formal disputation was held. Whether a non-speaking creature may be the vessel of a sanctified sign, arguments were made in Latin, Greek, and even Old Occitan. One student concluded, if Balaam's donkey could speak truth, why not a hen lay it? Alicende's silence throughout it all. Alicende said little. She continued to feed Blanchefleur oats and barley. She let pilgrims come and go. When offered money, she politely declined, except once, when she accepted a single silver coin too. Pay for repairs to her roof. The carpenter, she reasoned, deserved his due. What puzzled her most was not the glowing eggs or the sweet smells, but Blanchefleur herself. The hen did not cluck, as other hens did. She moved more slowly, as if aware. She was being watched. Sometimes she would sit for hours without lying down, her eyes closed, head cocked slightly skyward. Once, during a summer storm, Alicende claimed she saw a blue ring of light around Blanchefleur's coop. No lightning had struck. No candles were lit, just a faint, soft glow like moonlight caught in a bottle. She said nothing, she simply sat beside the hen and waited for the rain to pass, a miracle made mundane by the end of summer. The delegation had returned to Béziers. Their final report was inconclusive. The canon suspected heresy. The notary simply listed the observed phenomena. And Master Guillaume concluded that the eggs may be the result of an alchemical mystery known only to poultry and God. Rome sent no response. But that autumn, the bishop grudgingly allowed a small shrine to be erected beside the coop. Simple stone marker, etched with a hen and the Latin words Deus loquitur, etiam per ovo God, speaks also through eggs.